Okay, everything's working. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is still is refreshed. I just said to Jörg, if it's going to snow, then we would have had all the different weathers that we could possibly have in Munich in 3 days. It is my pleasure to welcome our first speaker today. Marya Schechtman is professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has a PhD from Harvard, and among her research interests are personal identity, autonomy of persons, and bioethics. And I think Jörg has put one of her monographs on the book table over there, 2014 at Oxford University Press, Staying Alive, Personal Identity, Practical Concerns, and the Unity of a Person, a book which at least I very much enjoyed reading. Marya, we were very happy to having you, and we're looking forward to your talk.
So thank you very much. I definitely want to take this opportunity to thank Jörg and Ludwig and all of the organizers, the coffee purveyors, the other speakers, and to welcome my web audience and thank all of you for being here on a Saturday morning. So I do have slides because I am hip and with the times, although in this particular case, I'm not sure that they do more than give you a picture to look at now and again. So mostly I'll be trying to convey my content through my words, but we'll see. So
just switch it the other way.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the other side.
Yeah, sorry. That way. All right, sorry about that. All right. So, as I told you, there will be limited content. So, I'm starting with Nathaniel Hawthorne. In the short story Wakefield, which he wrote, and his short stories are really wonderful, I recommend them if you haven't looked at them. The narrator reflects on a story that he says he heard in some old newspaper or journal that was told as true, and it's about a man who he calls Wakefield. And Wakefield one day left his home and didn't return for 20 years. And as it turns out at the end of the story, for some perverse reason, which never gets explained and which maybe Wakefield himself didn't know, he's been living all that time right around the corner from his house, just sort of observing his household that he left. And then, after more than 2 decades, we're told, his estate settled, his name dismissed from memory, and his wife long ago resigned to her autumnal widowhood, he entered the door one evening quietly, as from a day's absence. And so the narrator ruminates on what it would be like for Wakefield to return after these 20 years. And what he concludes is that Wakefield cannot pick up the thread of his life, or indeed any life at all, saying, "Stay, Wakefield, would you go to the sole home that has left you, then step into your grave." And he explains that amid the seeming confusion of our mysterious world, individuals are so nicely adjusted to a system, and systems to one another and to a whole, that by stepping aside for a moment, a man exposes himself to a fearful risk of losing his place forever. So in the end, Wakefield is presented as a kind of ghost who can do no more than haunt his previous life. He can't go back to it. So I started with Wakefield because I think it offers such a nice expression of the idea that the space we occupy in systems of social interaction, systems that themselves engage with one another and with natural systems, is central to who we are as individuals. And the intertwined systems described here give, I think, a nice approximation of the phenomenon that I've called person space, and that I'm going to talk about today. And that's a central concept of this view that I developed called the person-like view. And the idea that Wakefield somehow undermines his very existence or threatens it by stepping outside of this system is very congenial to my suggestion that we persist as human persons by, as I describe it, tracing a path through person space, something that I obviously need to explain, and that we cease to exist when this path through person space comes to an end. So I want to note at the outset that Hawthorne's story in no way whatsoever implies that Wakefield literally ceases to exist when he undertakes this experiment. He's obviously been living all along right around the corner in this place that he's rented, right? And I should also say up front that my view does not have the implication that in this story, Wakefield's existence literally ends when he removes himself from his household, and I'll explain why later. But I do read the end of this story, right? This very overwrought, go to the grave if you want to go to the soul place that's available to you, not just as a poetic way of saying that Wakefield has lost something important and precious by severing these relationships and stepping out of his life, but as saying that this loss is in a more literal sense, to take a term Harry Frankfurt uses in another context, in an unfamiliarly literal sense. Really an assault to his very existence. And whether or not this is a correct reading of Hawthorne, it is something that I want to say, and I want to try to explain. I want to explain more today in what sense I think that the place we occupy in a system of human interaction, which interacts with the natural environment, how that is a key part of what gives us integrity as single continuing individuals, and how the failure to occupy such a place can threaten that integrity in a really straightforward and direct way. So the claim isn't solely about what we find valuable in the life of a human person, but also about what actually constitutes such a life, and so on my view, what in turn constitutes a human person. And so to that extent, the view I've urged can be seen as a rejection of the claim that's made in the quotation that was given sort of as the central, the one we saw yesterday, as the centerpiece of the conference, the claim that no account of our identity has yet been proposed that guarantees the coincidence of what's important in our identity with the actual conditions of our identity, although I probably am not using coincidence or what is important, or maybe even identity, in the way that they were meant in that quote. But I think that that is something I want to disagree with in a particular way. So I hope to provide a clearer understanding then in what follows of the sense in which our role in person space contributes to our integrity as individuals, our role in these personal spaces of interaction, and how that relates to competing views of the persistence conditions of human persons, especially animalism. And I thought that Harold's, description of the two kinds of hybrid views was very helpful, and I've been ruminating on whether I reject the only X and Y principle, or whether what I really want to say is that if we're going to apply that principle, we have to attend carefully to how social changes and extrinsic changes can change the intrinsic character of the Y in a way that we usually don't, or the way in which they're connected. So I'm going to begin with a preliminary outline of the person life view, paying particular attention to the notion of person space. Once that's on the table, it may seem, I'm going to actually look at first a potential objection to the first very schematic presentation. Answering the objection, I hope, will clarify the view a little bit. I'm not going to be able to give the full details here. Then I think it's going to look like, once I've answered the objection, it's going to look like this is really a form of animalism. I'm going to argue that it isn't, or at least explain why I think it isn't, but I should say at the outset, even though I don't make the distinction here, I am a weak animalist. I'm weak and I'm an animalist. But it's strong animalism that I'm rejecting, the idea that psychological features play no role in our persistence conditions. So, let's see if I can, there we go. No, wrong way. Yeah. All right. So, according to the person life view, beings like us are fundamentally human persons. There may be other kinds as well. That's a different story, which I can talk about in Q&A. A human person is a being that leads a characteristic kind of a life, which I call a person life, and human persons are individuated by individuating person lives. A human person continues as long as a single person life does. So person life on this view is an ongoing process that involves interactions among biological, psychological, and social features. So in this way, I think, again, I'm giving a hybrid view. I think that's right, although instead of a plague on both your houses, I like to say in the true American spirit, you're all welcome here. So I obviously can't give a description of what each of these claims means, but let me try to go through and say a little bit about what each of these means. Okay. So, to provide according to the person life view, to provide some context, let me first note that the view aims to capture some of what's compelling in both traditional psychological accounts of personal identity and in animalism in a way that will, I believe, satisfy neither, and so hence the hybrid nature of it. Like animalism, the view allows that biological continuity has a central role to play in the persistence of individual human persons like us. And it says that we were all certainly human infants at one time, that we could persist in a vegetative state, but the picture was less cute, so I used to be infants. But like psychological views, traditional psychological views, it denies that each of us is strictly identical to a human, animal, or organism, and also holds that our persistence conditions are inherently connected to practical concerns, which are harder to find in Google Images. So you have these business guys being practical and making deals. So it's important to note that this view differs, I think, from both most forms of animalism and the psychological approach in the conception of personhood it employs. So I say here in my notes that animalism and traditional psychological continuity theories both presuppose a basically Lockean conception of what it means to be a person. Eric reminds me, animalists don't have to presuppose any particular conception of personhood, so maybe it's wrong to say that they assume a Lockean, but the discussion usually says, okay, we're conceding personhood to the Lockeans or the Neo-Lockeans. So according to this conception of personhood, persons are, roughly speaking, beings, as we've heard over and over, that possess sophisticated cognitive capacities like reason and reflection, practical capacities like moral agency and prudential concern. So where the real disagreement between the animalists and the Lockeans is on the ontological status of Lockean persons, with psychological theories at least implying, if not always saying, that this is a fundamental kind of entity. Lynn Baker, of course, does say it, but many of the views imply it. I think Parfit et al. Do. And animalists seeing personhood as a phase sortal. So while my view does argue for an inherent connection between personhood and practical features, the connection it draws is also of a somewhat different sort than in the traditional Lockean views. It's not as direct. The practical features don't determine our identity in quite so direct a way. And also, the range of relevant practical features that characterize persons on this view is much broader and more basic than in the Lockean conception. And this is really an important move for me. This isn't the kind of, personhood I'm talking about. So, in terms of the connection, the person like you doesn't understand what distinguishes persons from non-persons, primarily in terms of particular capacities that are possessed by individual persons. And this is something that Thomas Wuheim, I think it's very much of a piece with what he was saying. Personhood rather stems from the kind of lives that persons characteristically lead. And these are lives that are governed by a peculiar form of complex social interaction. So it's not my individually possessing reason and reflection that makes me a person. It's my living in a kind of way that is mediated by complex forms of social organization. More specifically, persons, as I understand them, live lives mediated by cultural institutions and practices. So if you're looking to see what's different between human persons and other kinds of animals that are non-persons, the place I'm looking is not to the specific individual capacities, but to the fact that we are enculturated, which of course is connected to the fact that we typically have these capacities in all kinds of ways, but is a different place, a different starting point. So I think that I claim that these institutionalized, pretty non-controversial cultural practices condition and mediate the multiple types of interactions among individuals that live within them, including the kinds of forensic relations that Locke talked about, right? The keeping of promises and attributions of moral responsibility and prudential reasoning, but also a lot of other kinds of interactions. And here I was grateful to Paul Snowden for talking about how much of our life emotion is and our personal emotions and attitudes, right? A lot of what we do with one another is not strictly about reason, and it's also not strictly, I think, about forensic interactions. Right, so there's caring relations between parents and children, including things like playing peekaboo and singing songs and doing things like that. That's a culturally mediated interpersonal interaction. Romantic relations, playing sports together, making music together, dancing together, right? Going to a conference together and then out to dinner, maybe going to see a film, taking a tour on the tour bus. All of these things are things that persons do, and all of them are mediated by these cultural institutions and social institutions and practices. So it's in this sense that I want to say that the practical elements that I think are inherently connected to personhood and personal identity are much broader and more basic than the Lockean forensic capacities. Those are part of the whole thing, but what I want to say is inherently connected to the conditions of our persistence is this much broader range of practical interactions and associations. So these types of interactions, many of the types of interactions that are part of our cultural practice, depend crucially on our ability to track continuing individuals over time, but they also constitute the tracking of individuals over time, I want to say. Our ways of re-identifying other people are inscribed all over our sociocultural infrastructure, both implicitly through many practices and explicitly through social institutions and teaching. We have name tags. I was the person on the schedule who has to come, who gives this talk. It's because I'm supposedly connected to that book. Getting on the airplane, I had a seat, I had to show my passport. Right, all over the place we have these ways of tracking people that are institutionalized in the culture. And I want to say that constitutes part of what keeps and unifies individual persons ongoing. So the set of codes and practices that we're talking about, or that I've been talking about, I say defines a space of interpersonal interactions or person space. I sort of just grabbed this term and now I'm called upon to say what it means. But there's a sort of web, network, space mapped out of interpersonal interactions that we can track people through. And so I want to say that to be a person is to be accorded and to take up a place in the space of interpersonal interactions. And a single ongoing person will trace a single continuous path through them, being re-identified in all of these ways that I talked about, as a trackable, ongoing locus of interpersonal interaction, right, of the sorts that I talked about, this re-identifying and tracking that goes with the practical concerns and through these practices. And they follow a recognizable life trajectory. It's not like there's a template for how to live a life. There's obviously huge variation with respect to individuals, cultures, places, and times. But it turns out there are life trajectory worksheets all over the web. So there is this idea that we're supposed to be able to see what a single life trajectory looks like. Okay, so now that I've said a bit more about the central claims of the person-like view, I realize if you don't already know it, it's going to be very difficult to follow, but I hope to fill it in a bit. I think a worry may already be arising for many of you. It's certainly one that arose for me, that the view might be socially constructivist in an objectionable way, right? Because if I say that it's our tracking of others actually constitutes the re-identification, or our according someone a place in person space actually makes them a person, it's going to seem that this could be morally worrisome, right? We get to just decide who's a person and when they're the same person, right, at our whim, which there are many reasons to fear. Metaphysically implausible, how does, right, that's sort of only X and Y, how is our deciding or judging that someone's a person going to make them one, or that they're the same person going to constitute a metaphysical fact of numerical identity, and probably both. So let me try to offer a quick reply to those concerns that may help clarify what the view really says. So there are two facts about the person-like view which I hope, when understood, will help at least somewhat mitigate these worries. So the first is that although the person-like view does insist that social factors play a role in actually constituting facts of personhood and personal identity, it doesn't say that such factors are the sole determinant of whether someone is a person or whether a human person at one time is or is not the same human person as one at another time. The view holds that the continuation of a human person depends upon biological, psychological, and social features, which are not merely amalgamated, like you've got these three tracks and you have to have all three of them. The point is that they are in dynamic interaction with one another, and it's this interaction that I think gets overlooked. So in this way, I think there are going to be echoes and points of contact with Katja's talk, with Goodhart's talk, and especially with Anna Sophia's talk about the sort of interactions that exist for creatures like us among these different dimensions of our existence. So perhaps the easiest way to explain what I mean by this is to look at the ways in which the claims I'm making about human persons are, and also are not, continuous with similar claims that can be made about other living things. So talk of organisms in the context of animalism versus psychological views frequently, but not always, suggests an understanding of organism in which the functioning of an understanding the functioning of an organism means looking at what goes on under the skin biochemically or within the membrane, depending on what kind of organism you're talking about. These sort of internal biochemical machinery that reconstitutes and regenerates and so on. But in fact, if you really want to understand an organism, and we saw this so nicely yesterday, we also need to understand its interactions with its environment, since having such interactions is absolutely characteristic of organisms and absolutely necessary for them to continue, and inner biochemical functioning maintains the integrity of a living thing only insofar as it interfaces effectively with what is outside of the skin membrane or whatever the units of the organism are. So for some living things, the next step says, the relevant kinds of interaction with the environment will be interactions, among other things, with a social environment. And so this is fairly straightforward for you social creatures like bees up there, and it's true in other ways for many animals. If they run in herds for protection, or they hunt in packs, you've got your wolves up there. If they collaborate on raising young, like elephants, I believe, do, and so on. Right? If these behaviors are crucial life-maintaining functions of the organism, which sustain their integrity as individuals, just as importantly and centrally, albeit somewhat differently, as the inner biochemical functioning and the machinery that repairs cells and so on does, right? So that is the second part of the claim. And then the next move for me is the claim that for beings like us, human persons, our social functioning involves enculturation, right? We have a peculiar kind of social functioning that other animals, so far as we know, don't, some might. So the exact origins of culture in human history are obviously not clearly known, but what is known is that once culture emerges, there's a feedback loop between cultural and biological evolution, such that enculturation comes to play a role in maintaining our integrity and functioning in something like the way that these other behaviors of other animals do. And so, sort of the next step is you've got parent-child interactions, which you'll see in many mammals, right? But here, there's glasses and they're playing a particular game on a rug, so enculturation comes in, and by the time you get to things like the doctor giving you medicine to boost your immune system, right? You've got a much clearer culture working on the integrity of the individual kind of thing going on, right? So what I want to say in saying that enculturation comes to play, or our cultural interactions and practices come to play this sort of integrity constituting role, is not just that these behaviors become important to or prominent in our lives and that they characterize the kinds of beings we are. I want to say that they become interwoven with our biological functioning in very fundamental ways, much like, running in herds or in ways in which you camouflage yourself do for other kinds of animals. And so there's all kinds of ways in which these cultural practices and biological functioning are interwoven. So over generations, for instance, the development of agriculture, sanitation, and medicine change elements of internal biological functioning in the beings that have them. Within an individual life, the existence of everything from music to language to vaccinations to dietary practices will have all kinds of direct impact on the biochemical functioning of the individual. They'll affect the synaptic pruning of the little baby. They're going to affect things like stature, age of first menstruation or menopause, vulnerability to all kinds of chronic diseases like diabetes, depression. They affect life expectancy and much more. So these are just a few examples of the way in which our cultural practices quite regularly interact with our biochemical functioning, and of course it goes the other direction as well, right? The way we function determines what our practices are. We have all these cultural practices around eating and mating and rearing young, because that's what we animals do. That's the kind of place where your cultural practices are going to begin, right? To the extent that religion addresses worries about mortality and the feebleness of the body, right, our biology is playing a role in what happens there. So the claim that sameness of person involves tracing a continuous path through person space thus does not imply that sociocultural practices on their own individuate human persons or define their path through person space. The view is rather that our judgments and practices interact in really complicated ways with biological and environmental facts, and that these interconnected functions together constitute us as individual entities with ongoing integrity, trackable through time. And like the theme that I'm going to try to keep hammering is just that I want to resist the idea, well, of course these things cause biological effects, they're causes, but it's what goes on as a result of them that makes you the same person. I want to say the whole dynamic is on an equal footing, and I'll try to explain what that means. So, my second related point is that there are constraints on the sociocultural practices that constitute person space. Human culture is part of the natural history of humans and develops within a natural context, and it's got to be responsive to, as well as influential on, environmental conditions and the biological nature of persons. The practices of interaction and re-identification that develop can't be arbitrary, or the culture that includes them won't be sustainable. So one implication of this constraint, which I can only just sort of gesture to quickly here, is that in human cultures, all humans will automatically be seen and treated as persons. I mean, animals do see their conspecifics in a particular way, and we are, among other things, since I am a weak animalist, human animals. So this may seem demonstrably false if you look at history, right? We may seem to have no dearth of examples of places where humans were treated by other humans as less than or non-persons. And that would be obviously true if the concept of personhood I was using was a Lockean or Kantian one, where seeing or treating something as a person meant treating it well or treating it with respect. But I mean, because cultures obviously can, it's more the exception than the rule, that they have institutionalized practices of treating some humans very badly relative to others, saying some humans can be badly treated, they don't have the same rights and moral status as others. But since I'm going for a more basic conception of personhood, in the sense that I mean person, I think we must automatically see and recognize and treat to be a sustainable culture all humans as persons in this basic sense, because it's just a fact that humans will eventually develop characteristic cognitive and physical capacities. And a culture that didn't recognize that other humans are of their kind in this sense just couldn't last very long, right? So you see this in the most egregious kinds of mistreatment of humans by other humans. So when humans degrade other humans by making them defile something that they take to be sacred, for instance, or to appear naked in front of others who are clothed, right? They're recognizing their fundamental personhood, because only some particular kinds of beings can be tormented in these particular kinds of ways, right? Beings who are capable of holding things sacred as we do, or caring about their nakedness, hence beings that are capable of enculturation. And similarly, when slaveholders make laws against slaves possessing anti-slavery literature, or being taught to read, or congregating in groups, they're codifying a set of practices that recognizes these slaves as possessing these certain basic person-specific capacities. So like the practices of ascribing personhood, I want to say, the practices of tracking and re-identifying persons that are inscribed in sociocultural institutions can't be arbitrary, right? You can't track people by first name and have it work out in the ways you want to. It's not going to fit the re-identificatory purposes for which tracking takes place, right? So in the world we live in, this means that the continuation of a single person over time is going to coincide with the biological life of a human. Otherwise, our practices of re-identification wouldn't do the work we want them to do. For instance, expecting an old friend to recognize you when you see them, or your employer to pay you for your work, or the child you vaccinated to have some immunity against the measles, right? We need to re-identify humans as well as in other ways, right? I'll come to that in a minute. So now that I've tried to answer this question about conventionalism, it may seem curious that I have in any way described this view as a competitor to animalism, right? If I'm going to ultimately say that all humans are human persons, and that the duration of a single human person over time is going to coincide with that of a single biological human, right? What is the person adding here, right? Why is this not just saying each of us is strictly identical to a human person, each of us has the biological persistence condition, a human animal, each of us has the biological persistence conditions of such an animal, and then I'm just adding, and by the way, it's characteristic of this particular kind of animal to have this particular kind of social organization. Other animals have other ones. What we all share, though, is our, right, biological persistence conditions, right? That, I mean, this is something I worry about. Why is this? You shouldn't worry about it, but it's the thing I question. Is the view just animalism? And I think the answer is not, and it's the thing that I said I was going to hammer before. So the most immediate answer to this question is that I think putting what I said that way, look, we're human animals, and by the way, this is what's true of human animals, putting it that way doesn't take seriously enough the claim that social functions interact regularly, dynamically, all the time with biological ones to maintain the integrity of the individual, right? That was what I was trying to get at with the discussion of the more general way in which social organization all the time contributes to the persistence and constitution of many living things. But even if we acknowledge that there is this feedback loop, or maybe especially if we do, right, you might still ask whether what I've described isn't still a variant of animalism, right? Why am I not just offering a version of animalism that differs from other forms by having a somewhat broader or different conception of biological life? And I think that's part of what Anna Sophia is saying. It's like, look, you can vindicate animalism if you just have a broader view of biology and you make that explicit. So why am I not doing that? And here's, I think, where I'm going to differ. While I do think that's one way you could go, I want to say that this, at any rate, is not going to be a form of strong animalism, and I'm going to differ because I think I not only want to give social and psychological, although I haven't talked about the psychological factors much, but both kinds of factors, a direct role in the individuation and persistence conditions of persons. I also want to say, according to right, this the biopsychosocial view that I'm talking about, that a person could in principle, and this is where I get to the hybrid view, could in principle survive being moved to another body, another human body, that through a cerebrum transplant or similar thing. Right, earlier I said that in our world, the duration of a human person will coincide with that of a human animal or organism. But the in our world qualification was required. And so now I'm going to try to quickly explain how I think this is possible and what it means. So, oh, and I have this, I love this Peter Singer quote. I'm not exactly sure what context he uses it in, but it so nicely gets to what it is that I'm trying to get at here. I don't know if we were social before we were human, but we were co-evolved social. Well, we probably were social, but we were enculturated and human at the same time. So let me try to get at the way in which I think this is really not a form of animalism by saying what I think the real difference is a deep difference in the metaphysical assumptions about the nature of beings like us, and maybe all beings, I don't know, that stand behind the person like you and animalism. So I am especially grateful to Eric throughout his work for laying out so clearly and completely the way in which specific metaphysical assumptions function in the arguments for animalism and the way in which animalism depends upon them. And I think both analyst and traditional psychological approaches presuppose what I would characterize, and here we're getting to someplace where I think I'm in sympathy with process metaphysics, but I don't understand it well enough to know for sure. But both approaches tend to presuppose what I would characterize not just as a thing metaphysics, but the more important point is an essentialist metaphysics, which is to say that there are individuals which are given to us. These individuals have traits, and which are essential, and some of these traits are essential to them. They are fundamental kind substance concepts in the sense that they are traits or properties that the individual could not lose and continue to exist, right? This is very clear. With animalism, I stop being an animal, I cease to exist, but also I think it is implied in the early psychological continuity theories, and it's very explicit in Lynn Baker, right? The sort of essentialist metaphysics. And then in animalism, I think there's this further assumption, and it was something we talked about yesterday, that organism is, if anything, is a fundamental kind of thing to be. Organism is a fundamental kind of thing to be. And I do feel like if you believe both the essentialist metaphysics, as I described it, and that organism is a fundamental kind of thing to be, it's pretty irresistible to be an animalist. It's hard to see how you could be anything else, right? Because then really things like the too many thinkers problem, I think, are really a problem. There are all these very strange results. So, I mean, obviously Lynn Baker did brilliant work trying to resist this, but I find the pull very strong. What I'm doing in the person-like view, I think, is taking a different approach and just assuming a different metaphysical model. This view relies on a cluster model according to which human persons are by their nature biopsychosocial beings, with no one of these facets being necessary and maybe none sufficient, that's a more complicated story, for the integrity or persistence of a human person. And the best way to understand what I mean by this is through an analogy with a similar kind of view, which was very influential on me, concerning biological death, that was offered by Winston Chong. And Chong enters the argument between those who defend a circulatory respiratory criterion of death and those who support a whole brain criterion. And what he says is, look, rather than trying to determine which of these is the correct criterion, I guess we're back to the hybrid model here, right? We should instead think of life and death as cluster concepts, such that, as in his words, the property of being alive, like the property of being a language or a game, little Wittgenstein there, right, involves a cluster of characteristics, none of which is itself necessary and sufficient for an organism to be alive, but all of which contribute to an organism's being alive and tend to reinforce one another in the paradigm cases. So if we're trying to characterize in either biological or metaphysical terms what ends a life, he says, this is very appealing because a standard and plausible general definition of death for organisms is something like the irreversible cessation of functioning of the organism as an integrated whole, right? And what biology suggests is that there are a lot of different ways in which organisms can either continue to function as wholes or cease to function as wholes, at least given a world where there are interferences and interventions possible. So in the paradigmatic case, organic life involves the functioning, right, of all the major systems. So for a being like us, right, we've got the endocrine system going and the circulatory system going and, right, all of our neurological system going. We've got the organs all pumping away. But there's a great deal of redundancy built into the human organism, and there are a lot of, coming back to humans now, and there are a lot of artificial interventions, life support systems, medications, dialysis, artificial insulin, antibiotics, antivirals, And all of these can do some of the work that natural systems are no longer capable of carrying out. And given the redundancy, even without those, you can lose some functions and keep going for quite a long time. So where artificial compositions, right, so the traditional approach to understanding death is going to tempt us to define life in terms of, what constitutes life and what constitutes death, in terms of that last function, such that when that one shuts down, now the organism is really gone. But what medicine teaches us is that lastness here may be merely chronological, right? The last thing to shut down may be different in different cases of death, that you sort of start losing your functioning gradually in many cases, and depending on what the illness is and what its course is, there might be a variety of functions. Cessation might undermine the integrity of and functioning of the organism as a whole. And so I've got this complicated web thing up there because, I think that is the picture. You think of something like a web where the integrity depends on all of these interwoven strands. If you start pulling out strands, its integrity is going to be compromised and eventually it will fall apart. But you might do it in different orders, and so which is the last one that makes the whole thing fall apart may differ a great deal, right, depending on where you start and how it goes. And what Chiang, I think, is saying is, and that's what the human organic system is like, right? You're going to undermine integrity of functioning, and eventually the thing falls apart. So just quickly, because time is ticking, I want to say something similar about human persons and the various biological, psychological, and social functions that in paradigmatic cases work together to maintain their form and functioning. Individual cases are almost certainly going to differ from paradigmatic cases, sometimes dramatically so, right? People have different ways of functioning, different illnesses, etc. And the question of how far they can differ and in what ways, without the integrity of the individual being lost and the individual human person ceasing to exist, is a complicated question that varies with context. But my key move is to say that rather than trying to decide which of biological, psychological, and social continuity is the form of continuity that can't be lost without the person ceasing to exist, we should acknowledge that the loss of any of these forms of continuity might be survivable, as well as noting that a loss in one set of functions will almost certainly cause deficiencies and problems in the others. So it's very rare, it's only in philosophers' minds, right, that you take one thing out and everything else is functioning perfectly. They often talk as if, right, severe Alzheimer's is something that doesn't affect you biologically, it's just a purely psychological affair, and right, clearly that's not true. So I, like the animalists, are going to say that human persons like us can survive in a persistent vegetative state, but it's important to note that on my view this isn't simply because the organism persists, but also because there's all kinds of practical relations that continue, and so someone who falls into a PVS continues a single trajectory through person space. This is going to depend a lot on context, but in our world they are in a hospital and they have insurance and people follow them. There's a lot of tracking that goes on. They aren't involved in interpersonal interactions in any robust or meaningful way. But there's certainly a social continuity as well as a biological continuity, right? But this view also has the consequence that a human person could in principle survive being transplanted into another human body through a cerebrum transplant. And we have to be careful with these cases because, right, they make all kinds of assumptions that are false and we don't know what, we've been told many times to worry about these fantastic cases. But what I'm willing to say, I think of these cases as a way of imagining what would social practice be, how would culture develop, how would our concept extend in this case. Sometimes it's really hard to tell, but the transplant intuition is so robust that I think you can make a fairly confident prediction that should such things really become possible, carefully enough imagined, right, where the other body is instantaneously gone and so on, you can imagine that it would be perfectly natural to track a person in the culture and the cultural practice would dictate tracking them to a new body. At least I think this is possible. And there are going to be all kinds of questions about that, perhaps, and I have some stuff to say about it in the Q&A, and where I don't have anything to say, my strategy is to say, yeah, but animalism has an equally difficult problem. So let me conclude very quickly by returning to the beginning. Human persons, on my view, are biopsychosocial beings who could survive the loss of either biological or social continuity. But what about social function and continuity, which admittedly plays a special role here, right? So people often assume that when I give this view, I'm saying that if you went off to a desert island or decided to go live in the woods, you would cease to be a person in some way, and maybe even cease to exist as an individual because you aren't having a track through person space. But that's not how the view works. I mean, especially if you have an adult enculturated person like Tom Hanks in Castaway, right? There's so much continuity already built in, and I can describe this more, I don't want to take too much more time, right? He's already, there's a lot of biological continuity, there's a lot of psychological continuity, and there's a lot of enculturation. That is Wilson, for those of you who know this movie. Right? There's a soccer ball that he makes into a face and interacts with because he's so desperate for social interaction, which I think is an important part of the story, as is the fact that people who are socially isolated for a long time suffer biological and psychological deterioration, in fact, right? It's not so easy to just have everything else continue happily when you don't have the social interaction. So I think that, right, I have all kinds of ways of saying even someone like this would continue, and certainly Wakefield would continue, because yes, Wakefield absents himself from his home, but he's still paying rent, he's still wearing clothes, he's still eating with utensils, he's still doing all kinds of things, he's very trackable. And because our cultural practices aren't that stupid, they have built into them the possibility that we could make mistakes. And so there are laws for things like what happens when you've settled someone's estate and you think they're dead and you've declared their wife a widow, but then, right, a biologically and psychologically continuous individual shows back up home 20 years later. I mean, we have practices for rectifying mistakes. So the view is not simply like we all decided that Wakefield is dead, so now he's dead. That would be an implausible view. But the view is rather just that the social and psychological components are so intertwined with the biology that it's really artificial to separate. So I think that the Wakefield case actually does, I'm really finishing up now, help to illustrate the fundamental importance of person space. He survives for all the reasons I've just given. And he does, in some sense, come back to his old life. But person space isn't tidy. It's made up of a great tangle of interpersonal interactions, like that web I showed you, right? And having introduced discontinuities into some of the most fundamental of these, he's pulled out some strands in the center. Wakefield has really weakened the web that is his life in a very fundamental way, just as having a very serious organic illness can affect your organic functioning even while you remain biologically alive. So Wakefield can't simply resume his own life, and so he can't simply resume his own life, so he has a path through person space that continues, he survives, but it's fragile and delicate, and in some sense he ends up as much a ghost as if he came back disembodied and couldn't touch people or eat anything, right? We have a lot of stories of this. You're somehow still there, but you're not fully there. So what I want to say is that the social unfolding of a life in interaction with its biological and psychological unfolding is all part of what maintains us as the individual beings we are. And for this reason, the question of whether someone continues over time and under what conditions is going to be sensitive to discontinuities and disruptions along all of these dimensions. So we don't make it the case that individual, X at T2 is the same as individual Y at T1 just by thinking or saying that it's the case. But the practices of interacting with and tracking others day in and day out has a profound impact on how human persons develop and function at all levels. And so their role in making us who we are in the most fundamental way shouldn't be overlooked or underappreciated. That is the person space in which we live. So thank you very much.